Ecological relationships. These are factors that affect our planet's biodiversity and, of course, populations inside of ecosystems. Why is it important? Why do organisms interact anyway? And within an environment, there's a limited amount of resources. Resources are finite, things that can be used. And many organisms share a similar habitat, which is its actual physical space. And habitat is the area within an ecosystem where an organism lives, where it resides. And that is all of the abiotic and biotic, so living and non-living factors. But each organism has a very unique niche. These are all of the things that an organism needs in order inside of its own habitat to survive. So because these organisms need a certain amount of space and very specific things, this leads to interactions and relationships that occur between organisms. The first one is predation. One organism kills or eats another one in order to obtain calories for food. So a predator is the organism that's doing the hunting or the killing, and the prey is the organism that is either eaten or killed or consumed. So things like a predator-prey relationship graph usually shows the cycling of responses over a period of time between a predator and its prey. Here is a predator-prey relationship. You can see that the prey is the solid line and the predator is the dotted line. So we see this spike in the prey. When more prey becomes available, the predator can do a better job, consume more food, its population size can grow because there's more things to feed its offspring, and its population increases. But as it starts to increase and kills more prey, then the prey die off, falling below the amount that is needed for that predator, and then the predator begins to decline. So it's often what we call a lagging line, where the predator's population lags behind the prey. A keystone species is a species that holds this whole ecosystem together. Throughout different ecosystems, there's lots of examples of critical species. These are all organisms that are critical for the survival of all the other species that are around them. That's why they're often called keystone species. A lot of times predators are considered keystone species. So I'm going to ask you, why do you think that is? Why would a predator, the ultimate eater who's consuming everybody, be considered keystone or critical for all living things in that ecosystem to survive? Amongst organisms, because space and resources are limited, we see competition. It exists between two or more organisms that are often trying to fight or compete for that same limited resource. It can come in two different forms, interspecific and intraspecific. So interspecific is occurring between different types of species. Think international, where we're different countries. So that's interspecific competition. Intraspecific competition is competing against within the exact same species. Like my goats right here, they're the same species. We can assume that that competition is over a limited resource, being the female, and they are competing. That is intraspecific competition. The competitive exclusion principle exists in order to explain how organisms don't outcompete each other. So no two organisms can really occupy that same niche, the same needs in the same time. So if an organisms, if they're very different, and one is probably better fit than the other, so there's just a competition that exists. If organisms are very similar, it will take a fight or some interaction, usually a negative interaction, to see who will win. And then the loser will have to find a different niche and space to occupy. Organisms often live very close proximity to each other. So symbiosis is an interaction that involves a very close, physical, long-term relationship between two species. And there's oftentimes one species that always benefits from this. It's interspecific again, so it's between two different species. So symbiosis, where one species benefits always between two different species. There's interactions involving a close physical proximity between them. One type of symbiosis that is close proximity is parasitism. So one organism is a parasite and it benefits from the relationship, while another organism is the host. And hosts are harmed. Can you think of an example of a parasite? My example right here in this photo is a tapeworm. This is a worm inside of a human host. The parasite is benefiting because it is gaining our resources, and the host is harmed because it is depleting the host of nutrition, living in its digestive system. Sometimes you would think that eventually parasites, if they're harming them, then eventually they'll die off too, because you can't just continue to kill everything and then expect to survive. So it's critical that a parasite form a relationship, a symbiotic relationship, where it doesn't necessarily kill the host. The host just is harmed or suffers. So for a parasite-host relationship to persist, the population must not have some sort of devastating effect on one another. So in my worm example, the tapeworm, that organism is still getting some nutrition, some food is passing along through by the worm's body and still making it to that, that organism's stomach. So a parasite must allow the host to kind of live long enough in order for that parasite to either be reproductive, survive long enough to be reproductive and make more offspring. In a symbiosis relationship called commensalism, one organism is going to benefit while the other one's not really harmed. It's not really benefiting and it's not really harming in another way. So my example here is these barnacles that are living on top of the oysters. You can see that it's just a physical space. The barnacle is taking up room, but it's not affecting the population of the oysters. They're just living symbiotically in a very close proximity, a very close location. We call that commensalism. And finally, our last type of symbiotic relationship is mutualism. That's where both organisms benefit, and both organisms benefit to survive. Our classic example is, of course, Nemo, the clownfish, and the sea anemone. The sea anemone has these poisonous cells, nematocysts, and provides the fish protection and a good, place to live. While the clownfish goes out and retrieves food and brings it back to the sea anemone, not only feeding itself, but also the sea anemone. So it's this mutually beneficial relationship called mutualism.